So today we're going to discuss why I'm doing these videos, a sort of a big picture kind of approach today. I think it's good to get at these every once in a while and sort of get back from the 10,000 foot view of what's really at stake here and why I'm interested in this. So that's coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. And when I say that, I say a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, that is the, I hope to have made that clear. That's sort of the kernel at the center of what I see the channel as doing, what I see my work here on the channel as promoting, or at least as attempting as best I can to promote. Wisdom in particular is one of these concepts which we come to in, let's say, philosophy is probably the most famous place you come to it. Philosophy means the love of wisdom in Greek. And wisdom, the thing about wisdom is that oftentimes wisdom is very simple. It's very direct. It's not something abstruse that's difficult to understand. It can be, but more often than not, in my experience, it's something very down-to-earth and simple. The problem with wisdom is not, again, oftentimes, not one of figuring it out, but one of remembering it. We know oftentimes the right thing to do in a particular situation, but we don't remember it in that situation. We remember it afterwards. We don't keep in mind the very often basic and simple kinds of instructions that we tell ourselves and have been told 100 times before. And so the point of any kind of practice, let's say, is one of reinforcing these kinds of wise practices that we tend to forget at the wrong time or at the right time, whatever. We tend to forget them when we need them. And similarly, when I say less stress, lowered stress, and kindness for that matter in the world, these are ways of our interacting in the world that make our lives better and that make the world a better place. And wisdom should be a route towards that. Our coming to terms with the world, our understanding the world in the right way, should be a route towards lowering stress, should be a route towards behaving in more skillful ways, in more healthy ways in the world. If it isn't, if wisdom isn't doing that for us, then it's not clear what the point of wisdom is at all. If wisdom is the sort of thing that doesn't help us in our daily lives, it's not wisdom, really. I mean, at the end of the day, because wisdom is something that really should be making our lives better in a very fundamental, moment-by-moment, day-by-day way, insofar as we have a handle on it and can remember, are mindful, let's say, of what that wisdom is. So my background, as many of you will know, I've discussed it a few times on the channel, is in philosophy. I did my undergraduate study in philosophy. I did my PhD in philosophy. I love the study of philosophy. I think it's fascinating. I think it's the kind of thing that, if I were only studying the philosophy, would be almost enough for me. But there are, let's say, issues with the way philosophy is studied nowadays, and that is that it's completely theoretical. If you go to a philosophy department, if you go and learn philosophy in school, you're going to be learning, for the most part, a bunch of theories. You're going to be doing academics. You're going to be reading a lot of papers. You're going to be arguing with papers. You're going to be in conversation with other academics about academic issues. And as many of you will know, once you get into that kind of atmosphere, the tendency, it's like a very strong magnet. The tendency is to get very, very deep very, very quickly, because otherwise you're not really able to get ahead. You have to get stuff published, of course. Publishing in any academic discipline, including philosophy, means getting into things that are very recondite, very weird, very the sort of things that don't touch daily lives to any degree at all. They tend to be arguments between 5 people, basically. And those can be fun, and I enjoyed them while I was doing them. There's an element of BS to it, I will certainly agree with that, but there's an element of honest attempt to understand whatever the topic is at issue. Does it have anything to do with wisdom? No. And I've discussed this with some of my friends who are professional philosophers right now, and I think they would agree with me that wisdom as such is not really discussed in a philosophy in the context of any kind of a philosophy program for the vast majority of them, let's put it that way. And one of the upshots of this is that oftentimes when I would teach, get into classes of students, it was difficult to motivate the questions. There's going to be a small group of people, and maybe some of you on this channel watching the channel, who are really interested in philosophy. You talk about some kind of topic about, the mind-body problem, or the issue of qualia, qualitative experience and consciousness, or the issue of modality. These are, deep, deep issues in contemporary philosophy, logic. And some people are just, they're drawn to those kinds of issues directly. I myself am to a degree. But for most people, they're not. And so they need a way to get into it. And it's difficult to motivate a lot of the questions that we deal with on a daily basis in a philosophy class. The topics that I found students most easily motivated by were topics in religion, philosophy of religion. Because philosophy of religion is directed towards more basic issues in general, more basic issues that seem, at least to many, to touch our lives on a daily basis. I would digress from that, or sort of switch from that to talking about sort of the history of philosophy here, because if we go back out of the contemporary philosophy that I'm talking about here into, let's say, pre-modern philosophy, into philosophy hundreds of years ago, we're going to see a philosophy that's more caught up in issues of daily life, that was really more about the discussions between rulers and philosophers, for want of a better term. The way that philosophy and the sciences were unified. A philosopher might do experiments. And, of course, there was a very close relationship between what would become philosophy and religion. And so if we go back far enough, we're going to get into, philosophers who are Christian, who are in the West. Here, I'm talking only about the West, because if in a contemporary philosophy program, and I did a video about this recently, I'll put up a link to, we're going to be basically discussing almost entirely Western philosophers. So if we go back, we're going to get to philosophers who are basically theologians. Although they were much closer to ideas of daily life, they were also coming at it from a very Christian angle, for the most part. And myself, I was never particularly motivated by Christianity. I never found it particularly plausible. If you do, that's great. I don't mean to dissuade you, but for me, it was not something that attracted me. On the other hand, if you get far enough back, prior to Christianity, into ancient Greece, there you do find a wonderful kind of flowering of philosophical understanding of the world that was intimately interested in issues of wisdom and in the way that we interact with the real world on a daily basis. And many of you will be familiar with, let's say, ancient Stoicism or Epicureanism or Cynicism, which doesn't have the same meaning it does today. It's an ancient school of philosophy. These kinds of schools were really intimately interested in bringing wisdom out to the people, in coming to terms with wisdom in our daily lives. And so that's a way that we can, I think, read those philosophers nowadays, those teachers nowadays, in the same way we would read the Buddha. Being sort of, if you like, brother or sister philosophers, sister thinkers, trying to find the best way to live our lives. And they came up with some very similar kinds of answers to the Buddha. Mostly, I think they were very similar answers. There are a few differences, and some critical ones, but in general, they were very similar. But one of the major differences with the approach of the ancient Greeks to the approach of, let's say, the Buddha, was that the ancient Greeks' approach was very rational. That is to say, when they asked these questions about what is the good life, about what is wisdom, about how can we make ourselves better, how can we approach that good life in our own lives, their answer was going to be almost entirely one of reasoning, of thinking ourselves to the good life, of sort of arguing ourselves arguing with ourselves about why we're doing this and why we're doing that, and trying to change ourselves through reason and argument. There's nothing essentially wrong with that. I mean, that's perfectly good as far as it goes, but in my experience, argument is not very strong in this regard. It really doesn't get us very far. In other words, if we don't find ourselves doing something in daily life, argument just becomes, or can become in my experience, a method of sort of trying to control what we can't control directly, of just beating ourselves up over and over and over again because we've been so stupid not to have seen something that we've seen already. There's an element of just calling yourself stupid over and over again because you don't get something in your daily life that you really get intellectually. The Buddha's approach was quite different, and different in, I think, a way that is extremely fruitful and interesting. And that is to say that the Buddha had a whole bunch of practices that were not simply rational. He had the rational ones as well, and he didn't have anything against reasoning. In fact, he argued and reasoned ways with lots of people. And a lot of the Buddha's practices were also practices of reasoning as well. But he also had practices of meditation, of calming, of direct seeing, of paying attention to the way that our minds worked on a moment-by-moment basis, that were not simply approaches of reasoning, but approaches of showing ourselves directly what the problem is with the bad things and what the advantages of the good things. So it's a kind of an empirical method that we don't find as such in the Western tradition, but we do find in early Buddhism. So, I mean, in my own life, I'd always been interested in Buddhism. Ever since I was a kid in grade school, I remember reading some Zen stories and finding them very appealing. And later on, I mean, in high school, doing meditation and continuing some of that even into graduate school, doing some Buddhist studies on the side. It was always something that interested me, but I never really, I should say, until I got really deep into the early material, I never found something that really resonated with me directly, because the later material that I was exposed to is more openly religious in its orientation, more directly legendary in its orientation, which is fine. For many people, that is what they resonate with themselves. Not so much for me. I wanted something more down to earth. And when I came upon the early material that resonated with a lot of ancient Greek material, both appearing to me very similar in the way that they were stories that appeared, at least on the surface, as far as I can tell, to be stories of real people grappling with real problems and finding real solutions to them. That was, I think, to me anyway, very appealing. And also, so that's sort of my own approach to it, and why I started the channel, or why I feel this approach using the early material is so important. Also, of course, it's important for the broader world. The ethics, of course, is so important to social justice, to issues of society, not only to our persons. Of course, we make ourselves better persons by becoming less stressed, by becoming less stressed out over things, by becoming kinder. But what we want to do by becoming better people, I hope, is to make the world a better place. I mean, the part of the issue here is one of ego. And again, the Buddha's approach to ego is also nearly unique. There were some Western philosophers, such as David Hume, such as the contemporary philosopher who recently passed away, Derek Parfit, who also understood this notion of non-self, that there's a very pernicious notion of self around in the world, in different philosophies and in just different ways of thinking. And that if we can give up this pernicious notion of the self and understand the world as being a world of causes and conditions that flows together, that we can all attempt to make better by changing what little we can change about ourselves in this life. And when we see that and understand our own approach to understanding ourselves as being minimized in the great scheme of things is to, I think, a benefit to the world, and in minimizing our own ego and minimizing our own conceit in the world. This is a way of making the world a better place. of making the world a more just place, I think, for many people. And indeed, contemporary brain science reaffirms many of the things that the Buddha himself said about non-self. That is, that there's no real locus of the self in the brain. It's simply a bunch of firings, neural firings, that cause a certain kind of cascade of different action potentials across neurons throughout the brain. And the self is a kind of a construct that we make out of this soup of different kinds of perceptions and thoughts and feelings. And there's nothing more to it than that. And understanding this, I think, can make us relax around so much, and so lower our own stress level in the world, make ourselves kinder, because we're no longer being crabbed by holding on to things as mine, so tightly. The reason I have this channel, the over sort of 10,000 foot view here, is to bring this early material out in a way that's, I think, understandable to a contemporary audience. And in particular, to bring out the ways that the material increases our own wisdom, that makes us wiser in the world. And it keeps that wisdom in front of our minds with a daily practice, which is so important. Again, it's not the knowing that's so important, but it's the mindfulness, the mindful knowing, the keeping it with us when we need it. It's the lowering of the stress by stopping to cling so much to things in the world. And it's not only the awareness that kindness is important, but the practices, the many practices that the Buddha outlined to help advance kindness within ourselves, and within the greater world. So I hope that those ideas resonate with you. If they do, and you're not a member, or you're not, I should say, a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. If you're not aware of Patreon and the patron program over there, consider taking a look over there. I have a bunch of stuff that I post every once in a while to patrons, little things that I find around the web, and I also allow early viewing of some of the videos. So if that's interesting to you, take a look. And otherwise, I'm really glad you're here. I'm really glad you're taking the time in your own lives, when you have so much else that you could be doing, to think about wisdom, to think about lowering stress, and to think about kindness for at least a few minutes every once in a while, because I think it can make so much of a difference to so many people. So thanks so much for being here. I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, all of you be wiser, be with lower stress, calmer, and kinder to one another. So, and be well.